Hello and welcome to another palette packed with a splash of paint, bursting with 60 colourful minutes of all the latest tips, demonstrations and exercises brought to you in association with the SAA, Society for All Artists. Let's get started and take a closer look at what inspirational products are coming up on today's programme. Alison Board will be demonstrating how to use masking fluid to weave a web of artistic beauty in today's Try Your Hand At project. We'll be shining the introducing spotlight on the work of SAA professional artist Kibble. I'll be showing you a few more of my own simple tips to help you develop your watercolour painting techniques. And versatile artist Keith Fenwick returns for the third and final part of his step-by-step landscape project. So let's kick things off and join mixed media artist Alison Board as she demonstrates how to combine masking fluid with a watercolour wash to weave a web of artistic brilliance in part one of today's Try Your Hand At project.
Thanks, Matthew. Hello. Today I'm going to show you all the things to do with masking out. And we're going to tackle a cobweb today. Quite a tricky subject matter, but hopefully by the end I'll have given you some tips in how to tackle it without too much effort. So I've got it all drawn out ready for you on this lovely Saunders Waterford watercolour paper, and I'm going to use 2 or 3 different tools for masking out. So the first one I'm going to use is a ruling pen, which is an old-fashioned draftsman's tool, but absolutely perfect for getting very fine lines with your masking fluid. And the masking fluid that I'm using today is the blue one, so that I can see it very clearly on my watercolour paper. It's also a lovely consistency, so that when you put it onto your watercolour paper, it's nice and thin and creates beautiful fine lines, which obviously you're going to need for your cobweb. So while I'm doing it today, I thought we'd think a little bit about what are the do's and don'ts of masking out. So one of the first things to think about is the tool that you use to apply the masking fluid. And it's very important that you use a very good quality tool for putting on the masking fluid, because you don't want it to dig into the surface. If you dig masking fluid into the surface at all, then it will become part of that surface, and when you come to take it off at the end of your painting, you'll find that it lifts the fibres of watercolour paper, especially when you are using a really good quality watercolour paper like I am using today. So don't, or try not to, use anything like a cocktail stick or anything that's got a really sharp point on it, because you can disturb the surface of your watercolour paper. The other thing that you want to think about is the applicator that's going to get the masking fluid on as thinly as possible. If you're putting it on and it comes out very thick and very blobby, it's going to sink into the surface of your watercolour paper. And of course, when it sinks into the surface of your watercolour paper, it's going to bind with the fibres of it. And then when you come to pull it off, it's going to pull the fibres off with it. So all these things you need to think about when masking. So the ruling pen is the thing that I found is one of my favourite tools for using with masking fluid. And as you can see, I'm producing some really nice fine lines. It does take a little bit of getting used to using a ruling pen. You do have to use it on quite a shallow angle. But once you've got the knack of it, you'll find that you probably won't go back to using anything else, because it's so useful. So for a subject matter like we're doing today, which is the cobweb, it's the perfect thing to use. So I'm drawing it on, putting it on relatively quickly because I don't want to hang about and I don't want it to sink into my surface. But I'm also trying to be fairly accurate. I've gone to all the trouble of drawing out this cobweb, and I want to keep to my pencil lines. And one little interesting thing about masking on top of pencil is that it will take an element of the pencil off when you remove it. It pulls the graphite off of the surface. So don't worry if you've been a little bit heavy-handed when you're drawing out, because when you mask over the top of it, you will find that it pulls an element of the graphite off the surface anyway. So if, like me, you are a bit heavy-handed with a pencil in your hand, this can be a massive advantage. So let's think a little bit about our cobweb. One of the things to think about when you're drawing a cobweb is to make sure that it makes sense. Try not to make it hang in midair, although they do, but you need to attach it to something. When you are constructing one on your paper, it's quite important that it anchors itself to another object, or if, like I've done on this side, it disappears off, but it assumes that it joins to a point. Also think about how much of the cobweb you're going to put in. It's very tempting when you're painting and drawing to put lots and lots and lots of detail in, but the danger of that is that you are then beholden to all those lines. You have to paint them in and you have to draw them in, whereas if you leave a little bit more to the imagination, then you can change your mind as you go And also for me, I think it makes a much more interesting painting. So this ruling pen is doing a really great job for me of all the fine lines. It's making a few little hits and misses here and there, which I quite like because, as you can see in my reference material, it's quite a wet, dewy morning that I took this photograph. So adding that on, sometimes, like it's doing right now, your ruling pen can get a bit clogged up, but that's fine. You can clean it off with your fingers, or you can clean it on a bit of kitchen roll, get rid of the excess, and then you can keep going. So back into the masking fluid, adding my fine lines, carrying on, making sure that it stays really thin on the paper. And we're working up towards the middle. This part of my cobweb's got quite a sort of baggy section, which I quite like, gives it some character. And my ruling pen's doing a great job of adding those lines. I'm going to switch to a different applicator in a minute, which you will see, but it's important that I get all of these construction lines in first. So there we go, up to the middle, pulling that across. Again, if it gets a bit clogged, you can always have a little separate piece of watercolour paper on the side just to clean it. Try not to overfill it. It's best to load the ruling pen in short bursts, then fill it too much and it come out in a great big blob. You may find when you're first starting using masking fluid or you're first starting to use a ruling pen that you do get a few odd blobs, but try not to worry about them. They're character. Add it to your painting and try and care a little bit less about what you're doing. It makes for a much more fun painting experience. So here we go, the last two bits that I've got over here. Very necessary, very important. Putting in that line, my ruling pen's getting a bit clogged up now, but I'll just change the angle of it and it will draw me a really lovely, perfect line. And the great thing about the blue masking fluid is, of course, that you can see it on the watercolour paper, so you're not guessing where you've put it. And it also means that if for some reason you have to leave the masking fluid on, and like me, you do tend to paint in a lot of bluey, purpley, mauvey tones, then it doesn't really matter. It can become part of your painting. Quite a few paintings that I've done in the past, I've actually looked back over them and realised that I haven't rubbed any of the masking fluid off at all, and it's just become part of the picture. So I'm just going to use the ruling pen for these last few little bits of grassy stroke here. Nothing too dramatic. And then I'm going to switch to my next tool. This is an embossing tool, which actually is used for pencil drawing, but it's really great for masking as well. Not for doing fine lines, but it's got a little ball end, and you can add some really rather fantastic dots here and there, which when we're talking about a cobweb on a misty morning is a bit of a necessity. So I'm adding them back in. Again, not too much, just a few to suggest what's going on. There we go. Quite a tricky technique, but if you're struggling with it, it's not a problem. Have a little bit of watercolour paper to your side, have a practice, see how you get on. So, adding a few bits here and there, not too many, just a few to suggest there are some water droplets. And now I'm going to switch to my last tool, which is this colour shaper, which has a beautiful rubbery end and can do some really lovely textural marks with masking fluid. Doesn't hold an awful lot of masking fluid to the surface, but you can just get some really good stroke techniques. So adding just a few bits here and there for a few little textural elements, just where my cobweb meets whatever I decide that this is going to be. At the moment it's a tree trunk, but it might turn into a fence post. We'll see what happens. And there we go. Just a few bits here and there, so that this little bit of foreground becomes part and parcel of what's going on in the background. And I've just realised that I've missed a bit of the cobweb, which is going to go in that little retaining line there. Right, while that's drying, I'm going to mix up a wash for my background so that I can start work on the foreground. So that's drying for me. There's a few little areas that aren't quite dry yet. Very important when you go to do a wash that you make sure your masking fluid is completely dry. If it's not completely dry, it will stick to the hairs of your brush, which if you've got a lovely sable brush like I've got here, you really don't want, and you'll end up picking them off every hair. So make sure it's completely dry, which it almost is, and I'm getting ready to put this wash of a background in. Now, I'm after a nice misty ethereal look to my painting, so I'm going to be using blues and purples and blacks. And one of the points of masking fluid is, obviously, you want this to look white. So don't put a pale wash into your background. It needs to be nice and dark and meaty. So we're going to mix all of these up ready. I'm going to have my black there. There we go. Going to have a violet. And going to mix it all up so that there are no little blobs left on my brush. And we're going to have some cerulean as well, which actually has mixed a little bit with the violet, which is a lovely happy accident. There we go. Mix all that in there, and then all those will merge together. So I'm going to do my background wet into wet. So I'm going to wet this area first, not very neatly. This is a nice impressionistic look to my painting. Just wet this area. Again, don't worry too much about it. Don't get too precious about it. You're going to drop the colour in and let it do its own thing. So there we go. I'm going to start off with this lovely happy accident colour, which is the cerulean and the violet together. And I'm going to drop that in quite early on in the wash. But what that will do is set the tone for the rest of it. And I'm going to let it hang so that the colour is drifting downwards, which is a look I really love in watercolour. That's the watercolour working really well for me. And then some violet behind. Again, it's running like mad down the page, but that's such a lovely thing to have in watercolour. And then I'm going to be really brave and go in with my black, which has turned into a rather delicious purpley colour. And then I can just, if it's running away from you, then don't worry. Take your kitchen roll, soak up the bottom parts of it, and just let it do its own thing. And this is the point where you really want to sit on your hands and make sure that you don't go back in and poke it to death, otherwise you can ruin it. So I'm going to let that dry, and you can join me later in the programme where you'll see me finish it all off.
Thanks, Alison. A great practical project for getting to grips with masking fluid. We look forward to seeing the finished result later on in today's programme. Well, folks, time for a little break now, but join us in part 2 when we'll be shining the introducing spotlight onto the work of SIA professional artist Carol Kibble, and I'll be showing you a few more of my own simple tips to help you develop your watercolour painting techniques. See you soon.